Welcome to Talking Legal with Templars. My name is Chiamaka Nwangwu. I'm an associate in the finance team, and I'm here with Dr. Jude Odinkonigbo, counsel in our tax team. And today we're going to be talking about the sanctions regime in Nigeria. So, Dr. Jude, last year was very eventful. Russia invaded Ukraine, and as a result of that, we heard that states, especially the United States, the United Kingdom, and international organizations imposed sanctions on Russia. But what really are sanctions? What are economic sanctions? And what rights do states have, or do these bodies have to impose sanctions on Russia for states on other states or individuals in general?
Well, we just say that sanction is a coercive measure used by supranational states and also supranational organizations to whip in line states, recalcitrant states, individuals, non-state actors to behave in a particular way. So, for instance, if the sanction giver feels that a subject or a target is misbehaving and not comply with international laws or laws of a state, the sanction giver could sanction that particular state, non-state actor, or individual. So in terms of having the right, yes, United Nations or any of the supranational organizations, they have the right to impose sanctions on recalcitrant states, non-state actors, and individuals. So sanctions is one of the instruments that is used to ensure that there's a counter to that such a profession of weapon of mass destruction, terrorism, financing of terrorism, and all that. So it is designed to achieve a particular goal, changing behavior of the target. So for world peace and security, that's why it is given.
Okay. So, we've been using international organizations, the UN, we've talked about the United States and the United Kingdom, but to bring it home, as sanctions, I noticed you mentioned supranational organizations. So are sanctions also imposed by, say, any African bodies or by Africans?
Coming down to Africa here, for instance, African Union, ECOWAS, and other regional bodies, and even Nigeria, other countries, they do have the right to impose sanctions. Recently, we've had military interregnum in some West African countries, for instance, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Guinea. So ECOWAS imposed sanctions on those countries, and the major goal is to ensure the restoration of democracy, because military regime is no longer fashionable. So the essence is to make sure that, for instance, there is sanction on trade and financial sanctions, transfer of financial instruments and all that. ECOWAS did impose, and that sanction is still, the sanction is still ongoing against some of these countries for overthrowing civilian regimes in those countries. So that's an instance.
Very informative. But I assume that for these sanctions to have any effect, there has to be structure in place, some sort of legal regime. And I like starting with foreign states. So what do we really have in the United Kingdom, in the United States, to implement these sanctions when imposed?
Well, in both countries you mentioned, the Department of Treasury. For instance, in UK, you have the Office of Financial Sanctions Implementation in the UK, and you have the Office of Foreign Asset Control in the United States. These bodies are meant to let the members let the country, the business community, and all the people involved to understand what the sanctions are about, and also the enforcement and implementation of those sanctions. So OFAC, which is part of the Department of Treasury in the United States, enforces sanctions in the United States. The same thing with the FSI in the United Kingdom. So these are legal frameworks or bodies set up to monitor. You have the list of the sanctions given by your country or United Nations, and you ensure that they're implemented to the leaders.
Okay. So I understand in the United States, there's the Office of Foreign Assets Control. United Kingdom, there's the Office of Financial Sanctions Implementation. But what do we have in Nigeria? How do we...
Well, in Nigeria, it appears that there's no organized central body that enforces sanctions the way it is in United States, like the OFAC. Not up until, I think, 2013 that a regulation was issued to set up a sanction committee in Nigeria, which presently is codified and created under the Terrorism Prevention and Prohibition Act 2022. The TPPA, that is Terrorism Prevention and Prohibition Act, TPPA 2022, created the Nigerian Sanctions Committee, of which the Attorney General is the chairman. So the sanction committee, the sanction committee is designed to implement sanctions, financial sanctions, but these are related, restricted. The functions is circumscribed to enforcement of sanctions relating to terrorism financing, proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, or financing of weapons of mass destruction. So, and also to ensure the implementation of United Nations sanctions, any of the resolutions of United Nations, UN Security Council's resolutions relating to terror issues, relating to terrorism financing, and also proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. The sanction committee is meant for the implementation of that in this country. So unfortunately, the job or the function of the sanction committee is circumscribed to those areas that I mentioned. It is not wide enough to incorporate matters relating to financial sanctions in other areas.
Okay, so from what I'm hearing, the regime we have in Nigeria is inadequate. It seems to be restricted to some specific sectors, and it's a bit tilted to even one body. So so essentially there's a weak regime in Nigeria.
There's a weak regime, and if I may add that it appears to be sector-based. The enforcement of sanctions that are not related to terrorism financing, proliferation of weapons of mass destruction are mainly sector-based, or it is decentralized. For instance, in 2016, the United Nations resolution imposing financial sanctions on North Korea. The Central Bank of Nigeria issued a circular directing all the financial institutions in Nigeria to enforce that sanction. So, but of course, the status of circular, the legal status of circular, they're not laws, and you can't actually go to court and say that you enforce it. It doesn't have that legal force. But regardless, that is the way sanctions appear to be. Sanctions not related to the area that the sanction committee oversees in Nigeria, are enforced.
So it appears the legal regime for implementing sanctions in Nigeria is inadequate. Like you said, National Sanctions Committee doesn't cover all sectors. How do you think these affect businesses, multinationals? How does it hurt? How does it hurt their businesses?
Within Nigeria, businesses or multinationals that are doing business in Nigeria are not likely going to suffer much because there's a weak regime. The chances of the Nigerian government imposing very strict penalties on them is very slim. However, the problem is that sometimes most of these sanctions are transnational, or sanctions imposed by United Nations or US. So they have bodies that monitor this. So if there is a sanction imposed by United States and the company comes into Nigeria to violate that, because Nigeria has a weak regime to enforce it, chances are that that company is going to be punished in US, because many of them have assets in the United States and some of these Western countries. So that is the implication. And again, another implication is that for a very good a corporation that wants to be a good corporate citizen, would want to abide and want to obey the laws, both national and international. So in any case, they will have a professional that is going to continue to advise them on what to do within Nigeria, knowing full well that we don't have a very effective sanctions regime in this country. So the overall implication is that a very cautious company or multinational wouldn't want to come into Nigeria to do business if we don't tighten up and strengthen our sanctions regime. So it is left for Nigeria to fill up these gaps.
And in filling these gaps that you've pointed out, if you were in the position of a legislator or a stakeholder in government, How would you do this? What does Nigeria need to do to fill in the gaps in terms of laws, in terms of the powers of the Sanctions Committee?
Well, already that we have the National Sanctions Committee. The only problem is that the functions of National Sanctions Committee is limited only to sanctions relating to terrorism, terrorism financing, proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, or proliferation financing. So if the law is amended or a new law is enacted to expand the function to include financial sanctions imposed on states for violating a particular sanction, it could be financial sanctions. For instance, the sanctions against Russia cannot be enforced by National Sanction Committee because it doesn't fall within its province, its remit. So the sanctions against ECOWAS, those states where you have military interregnum, Mali, Guinea, Burkina Faso, National Sanction Committee will not discuss that. And we have not seen any statement issued by National Sanction Committee because it's outside its functions. So in any case, the point will be the law, either you amend the TPP Act or it has to be renamed anyway.
So you can just cover terrorism.
So that covered terrorism, you can set up a body just like the OFAC in US or that of OFSI in UK to cover other financial sanctions. So if we do that, the next step will be to train the personnel and let them be well trained to understand what they're supposed to do, and then coordinate with other bodies outside Nigeria.
Yeah, and I also wanted to speak to what you had said about circulars, the impact of circulars. So you had said the National Sanctions Committee deals with sanctions relating to terrorism financing and especially resolutions of the United Nations, while certain sanctions are implemented through circulars. But what's the position of law on that, and how can that be remedied?
Well, of course, that a circular is not a law, and there are decided cases on that it is not a law. It doesn't have legal weight. So relying on circulars to enforce sanctions, that shows the weakness in our system. And I give example of what happened in the 2006 United Nations Security Council resolution that imposed sanctions on North Korea. So the central bank issued a circular to all the financial institutions in Nigeria. And also, of course, designated non-financial institutions or professionals, DNFI. So point I'm making is that the circular that was issued to financial institutions, yes, they can obey that. They will obey that. But if there is any particular institution that decides not to, how will CBN enforce it? You go to court and say that I issued a circular when there is no legal instrument, there's no an act, there's no regulation made that empowers you to do that. So if you're going to rely on any particular legal instrument, it has to be that law or regulation prohibiting a particular thing or empowering you to do this. So you can't rely on circular.
Circular doesn't have the force of law, and
it does not have the force of law, yes. So that's why we say that what we have outside the areas covered by National Sanction Committee, actually it is decentralized, it is weak, it is not coordinated at all. So that's part of the problems we have under our sanctions regime in Nigeria.
So just as a final question, we know there were a lot of sanctions imposed on Russia from the EU, from the United Nations, from states. Do you really think these sanctions actually have a serious effect? Because Russian forces haven't left Ukraine. So at the end of the day, what really is the impact of this economic?
Well, I think we may just expand it generally to how effective sanctions are to compel targets to behave in a way that the sanction giver wants the target to behave. Well, there are authorities that believe that, sanctions is not actually, most of the time, it doesn't achieve its purpose. But I would say that sanctions bite, but it bites slowly. Just believe that sanction is just one of the instruments within the bodies of instruments that could be used to cause behavioral changes.
Thank you, sir. So I understand that sanctions are measures put in place by states and international organizations to change behaviors of recalcitrant states. And there are usually regimes in place to implement these sanctions. In the UK, we have the Office of Financial Sanctions Implementation. In the US, we have the Office of Foreign Assets Control. In Nigeria, we have a regime in place, but it's lacking. We need to do more in terms of laws, or this will affect businesses negatively. Thank you. So we've just finished speaking about the sanctions regime in Nigeria, and we have a publication which deals with this in depth on our website. This has been Talking Legal with Templars. See you next time.